Hello again, Internet, YouTube, everybody who may or may not be watching. It's another beautiful day here in Western New York, and it's time for Ziti TV. This Ziti TV is going to be, let's share the screen. This Ziti TV is going to be about building an overlay network with Docker. We had a user on the OpenZiti forum, the support forum, which you can find by going out to openziti.discourse.group, and they reported they had a problem with using the Docker-based install, and it's a really common problem that lots of people end up having. And so I thought it would be useful to do a Ziti TV on that. Along with that, I have already created a video for that Docker post, and you can find that Docker post. That is not the Docker post. Let's go find it. We'll just go to Discourse and we'll look at, let's remove the bookmarks. It is this one. It's this post right here. And I made a video. It is unlisted on the YouTube channel. Hello. Thanks for saying hi. Is that Giacomo? All right. And you can find this out there. And I'm going to use the same diagram, and I'm basically going to do the same sort of thing I did in that particular video. So if you want maybe a shorter version, because it's only going to be 15, that's only like a 15-minute version. And to be honest, the first, I think 15 minutes, maybe not 15. Let's see how far it goes. Let's turn off the audio and pause this. About 8 minutes is dedicated to Docker type stuff. And then after that is dedicated to using the Ziti admin console. So if that's interesting to you, go out and check out that Discourse post, or go out. It's unlisted, so if you're interested in finding, you know what I'll do? Maybe I'll just copy this, and the unlisted Discourse video is here. I can put that into the chat. And so yeah, you can check that out if you're interested. So this is what we're going to end up doing, and a friend of mine, Nick Fragali, he made a draw.io diagram and showed me what is one of my favorite things, and that is this little animated line. It's my favorite thing about draw.io, is to being able to show people the animation. How does the connection actually work? And so this diagram that you'll see here on the right hand side, it'll say AWS. I'm actually not going to use AWS. I'm going to do this entirely on my local computer. I run Windows, as you may or may not be able to see down here, and so I'm going to use Windows, and I'm going to use Windows subsystem for Linux, and I do not use Docker desktop. So if you are a Docker desktop user, maybe you'll learn some Docker CLI commands today. I installed just the engine and use it exclusively from within WSL with systemd. Anyway, this is what we're going to end up doing. And you can see we have a Docker-based install on the right-hand side. And, this little network is going to just become, my whole home network. And I could do this on Amazon again, if that's interesting to people. But what I'm going to do is in WSL instead of AWS, is I'm going to deploy a overlay network that's good for a developer doing developer things, or network engineer trying to learn how to do Ziti, or just some person who wants to self-host things and wants to see, how it is I would go about setting up my own overlay network using Docker. And so that's what this is about. And so if we go over and look at the documentation, from the documentation page, and this is recorded April 26, 2024, so it might change. But out here under Quick Starts, you'll find a network, and under network, you'll find a few different ways of deploying, a few different kinds of topologies you can deploy. You can run everything locally without Docker. That is also effectively equivalent to the host it anywhere. It just skips some steps and assumes some things that you don't particularly assume when you host it anywhere. There's local without Docker, and we can get into that if we want, but I'm going to focus on the Docker Compose. So the Docker Compose one is nice because you just type Docker Compose up, and up comes your network, and that's just really handy. And I made the original Docker Compose file here, and this will help. If you go out here and read this, you'll see that the deployment diagram of this particular Docker Compose file is really complicated. And it was done on purpose. It was trying to be an educational vessel for people to learn, what it is to have an overlay network, what a red network versus a blue network is, why those exist, that sort of thing. And the whole idea here is trying to emulate in one local machine a segregated network from another segregated network. Now, it turns out with Docker, it's not really particularly easy. And that's why there's this purple network, because everything in the purple network is on both the blue network and the red network. But everything on the blue network is not on the red network, and everything on the red network is not on the blue network. And so this is the complicated example Docker Compose I made for people to learn with. It turned out nobody used it to learn with. They used it to stand it up and learn on their own without really, using all of the complexities in here. So at some point, we made the deployment simplified section right down here, and I'll put that in the chat too. And this is all also going to change because we've learned a lot of things and made it even easier. And if we have time, we'll get into the all-in-one Docker Compose container file that Ken has been working on that we're not quite ready to release yet, but we'll take a sneak peek at it. But this simplified Docker, this is a much easier Docker Compose file. It is made entirely of two, well, maybe three services, and a service in Docker land is just some container that's running. So there'll be a router, it's not big enough. Where is it? So there'll be a controller, there'll be an initializer container. This is done for your ease of startup, and there'll be an edge router. And those are the, oh, and this also comes with the Ziti console. Didn't realize that. The Ziti console is the UI. So we'll see all these things. This is what I recommend people start with nowadays. So the first thing you're going to want to do is grab this compose file. You can get it from here. So, this is GitHub and the raw view. But a slightly easier way to do it is if you go to the top of the Docker file, you'll see you can curl down the Docker Compose file from get.openziti.io. It's a shorter URL. You can just copy this. It's a lot easier. But when you copy that, remember that you actually want the simplified compose file down to docker compose.yaml. I'm a YAML kind of guy. And so if we look at the if we look at the docker compose.yaml, okay, that's not the right URL. What is the right? Did I typo it? Let's go back. So, simplified Docker Compose. Yeah, right. So simplified Docker Compose. Okay, 0 for 2 here. Click on this. Yeah, that's right. What am I doing wrong? Okay. So this is the correct URL. Curl this out to dockercompose.yaml. Oh my goodness. All right. I know I downloaded something. Let's vi dockercompose.yaml. All right. Well, I don't know what I did wrong the first couple times, but I figured it out finally. Let's see. Did I type? I did the YAML thing. Let's remove this. Didn't even notice I did that. All right. So we have downloaded the dockercompose.yaml. That's step 1. And step 2 is to curl down the environment variable. And I understand, I'm not a good reader, but this is really important. You do need both of these things. And it's very easy to miss the fact that you want to curl down the environment variable file too. So let's go ahead and do that. And now I'll have one. Oh, I didn't send it to a. Does that really? -o, copy, paste. Oh, it's an env file, so it's hidden. TRAL. That's why. I was wondering where it went. Docker is really cool. It gives you some interesting flexible things like this .env file. And what it will do is it gives you the ability to go in and change some stuff. And so since I'm running all this locally, I don't care about showing my password. But here are all the minimal amount of things that you really need to understand and know when you start up your own overlay network. And really, this is going to boil down to just a few things. The ZD password, I'm going to use admin. The name for your controller, and this is just used when you emit files, so it's not particularly interesting. The advertised address of the ZD Edge controller. This is just, I can't understate how important these two fields are, because these two fields currently, and again, we're simplifying this so that there'll only be one of them eventually, but this is also meant for educational purposes. So let's go back and reference that draw IO diagram, and you'll see in the ZD controller, there are two ports that are out here that are important. Port 7501 in my example, and port 7502. You can use any ports you want. I'll use some other port. The default ports, if you don't care, if we come back to here and we look at the default port, I should have made that 1280, but I kind of normalized it to our dock. But the default port in just ZD is 1280 for your control plane, for your controller's APIs. And so actually I have a controller running locally, HTTPS localhost on the default 1280. So if you just curl to that default port, you'll get an HTTP response. It'll be JSON. Also, actually, we'll use SS minus LNTP. We see port 1280 is in here, and that's, I need a process sudo. And you can see it's being run by PID 1419. And so there should be another, there's not another one because I didn't expose it. I see. I'm going to have to exec, docker exec, t into, it's probably edgex ZD controller. No, open ZD. Yeah, bash. Let's hope SS is inside of here. It's not. Netstat. Okay, apt install net utils, net-utils. Hey, appreciate that, RBGTK. Apt is not installed. Okay, well, in here, there should be port 10,080 is curl around. Curl is here. All right, so curl http://localhost:1080. Connection refused. Boy. All right, well, this is going over like a lead balloon, so we're going to just skip this. And we'll go back and we'll look at the diagram, because the diagram tells me what it is. Port 7502, in this case, this is the control plane. And when I say the control plane, you'll see in here what's not called out is how the ZD router communicates to the ZD controller. And that's actually done through the control plane. So if I were to grab one of these guys and put it onto the router is going to connect to port, 7502 in this example. By default, that is 10080. That's just the port that's the default. Oh, I know how we can see that. We can run the ZD command. We can create a config for controller, and we can get a default config. Let's put this into less so it's easier to see, and we'll look for 10080 in here. No, 1280. Let's see, there's 1280. So it's used my default port. Where is the listening port? Address. 1280. 1280. Where is 1080? I don't see 1080 in here. Boy, I feel like I have missed a memo somewhere. Maybe I screwed it up. If the Docker image is Alpine based, let's see this. Docker image is Alpine based, use APK to install packages. Well, that's really good to know. It very well might be. I don't know. But that's a good point. Thank you for that. Where's 1080 in here? Address. This is the Edge API. That's not what I want. I want the, right here. Oh, I take it back. It's 6262. My bad. So by default, 7501 is actually 1280. And by default, 7502 is 6262. And that's because routers by default are port 3022. Come on. And this one is 1080. All right, we'll get to that in a minute. So we're going to go back into our environment variable file. And I forgot to write my password and my advertised address. Now, actually, let me make another file down, or another shell down here. Hello, Come on, terminal. Make it bigger. Make it bigger. Control. All right. It's been doing this a lot lately. Exit. No. D. Duplicate. I don't want a duplicate terminal. I want to close this one. Thank you. All right. So you can see this machine's host name is SG4U22. It's an Ubuntu 22 machine. And it has this IP address, which is bridged into my local area network. So actually, this is not bridged. It used to be. It no longer is. I can tell by the subnet 253. This is actually no longer bridged to my. It's only bridged through the virtual Ethernet switch from Hyper-V. So this is the host name. And when you add this advertised address and this controller advertised address, you need to really think about where you're going to deploy your things to. Now, generally speaking, when you're deploying to the internet, you want to use the externally facing address that everybody on the internet can access your controller and access your router. And you want to do that so that you can get to your stuff from anywhere, right? You don't have to keep it externally routable. In my case, SG4U22 is this Ubuntu machine, but I could use localhost 127.0.1. I could use SG4U22. It doesn't really matter. What matters is that this address is routable by all of the things that you want to communicate to your controller. So if I look at my local machine and I ping ZD Edge controller, because I have used the hosts file, let's see, hosts, because I have added a hosts file entry, I can access ZD Edge controller. And so all the things I'm going to do today are all going to work because I'm going to just keep them locally. But if I were to go to another computer, then I would want to make sure that I use an advertised address that is routable by the entire network of all the things that you want to connect. So here in my house, I have another laptop that's right over there. It's SG3. And if I wanted SG3 to get to SG4, I would have to use an IP address that is routable by SG3 over to this computer. Hopefully that makes plenty of sense. If we go back to the diagram, this machine just has to be able to get to this machine. All right. I hope that all makes sense. And now you know why get out of here, why I am able to access ZD Edge controller. So use whatever works for you on your machine. I'm going to just keep it ZD Edge controller, but I wanted to explain that because it's really easy to, in fact, maybe I don't know. We'll come back. We'll do the internet one here in a bit. Maybe I should just start with it. Actually, no, I can't start with it because then you'll see my IP address and you can log in and all that stuff. All right, so we'll do that after. All right, so we're going to just leave these defaults for me because I know I'll have a ZD Edge controller and I'll have a ZD controller. The other thing you can do, and I don't know if it works yet, but eventually you'll be able to only have one entry in here, and the all-in-one works like this, as does the quickstart, the other ZD Edge quickstart. And this just makes it even easier to stand up your overlay network. All right, I'm gonna undo this, and now we're going to talk about the ports. So let's just choose a couple of ports. The Edge advertised port, again, I said it was 1280 and 6262, but I'll just keep it to the diagram. So the Edge advertised port is going to be 7501, and the control plane 7502, right? Yeah. Okay. Down here, the ZD Edge router name. When you start your first overlay network, if you want anything to connect to anything, you must have a router. No ifs, ands, or buts. The router must be Edge enabled, so it should be an Edge router. And it doesn't need link listening. Link listening is when a router can connect to another router, but it does need to be Edge enabled because all of your identities, whether they be tunneler based, like my Windows based ZD Edge tunnel here, or the Linux ZD Edge tunnel, or the Mac OS version of the ZD Desktop Edge for Mac, or Android, or whatever, they will all need an Edge router, a router with Edge enabled on it to connect. And so we have to have one of these. And so if you don't set them up, if you don't change these, they'll just be the defaults. But you can go in here and change these. And the same is true for the Edge router's address. It's vital that you get this right the first time, and this is such a common mistake that Ken and I were just talking about, making it so You can't have it. It won't start if you don't put a valid value in. And you as the operator, you need to know that like those addresses are the most important things you got to get right, because what will happen when you do any of the installations or configurations is you'll get a PKI, a public key infrastructure emitted or built for you. That PKI is how OpenZT will do all of its mutual TLS. So it's really important. You can't get it wrong, because if you get it wrong, all your certificates are wrong and then nothing works. So really another common problem people have is they'll come in here, they'll do all this with Docker, they'll use hosts file like I did, and then they'll move it someplace else thinking that it'll work, but they'll move it from home to EC2 dot whatever. And the certificates will say, this certificate is valid for ZT Edge router, not EC2 dot whatever. And at that point, you're toasted. All your PKI has to be regenerated. When you regenerate your PKI, it means you're going to have to re-enroll your routers. When you re-enroll your routers, you're going to have to re-enroll your identities. It's devastating to your overlay network. So you got to get it right that first time. Almost everything else, ports, configurations, almost everything else is not important. And if you're running your own PKI, also not important, right? If you're savvy enough to do it yourself, it's not important. But getting that address right for most people, super, super important. Going back to draw.io, 7503, this will be the edge port. So in the environment variable, we have ZT router port and ZT router listener port. The listener bind port, this is actually 7503. This is how other routers will connect to this router. And 7504, my bad. Yeah, 7503. We have another question. Do you put multiple edge routers behind a load balancer if you have multiple? What a great question. The answer to that is, if you want. You don't have to. Generally speaking, I would say I don't see them deployed behind a load balancer. Generally, the edge router is the edge of the DMZ or the untrusted zone, or wherever you would usually put that internet appliance is the edge router. You can put them behind an edge router, but if you do that, you'll have to use a TCP load balancer, because if you terminate TLS, it'll never work. OpenZT, mutual TLS, you cannot terminate that TLS. It won't work. I mean, ZT has to be able to establish that root of trust and trust what it's connecting to. So if you put it behind a load balancer and terminate TLS, it'll never work. If you try to put a man in the middle or a person in the middle and do deep packet inspection, it'll never work. If you want to do that, then there's a great place for innovation, is to build a DPI type utility around OpenZT, where you can send all the traffic to your DPI inspector and make decisions. But OpenZT hasn't tried to tackle that particular problem just yet. We do have an eBPF type of thing that is not quite that, but is trying to do some sort of like ZT firewall type stuff. But that's a good question. Generally, routers do not need to be placed behind a load balancer. All of the routers will have a unique advertised address, and when your client comes online, it will be told what routers are available, and it will try to connect to them. And whichever three, and three is configurable, but whichever three come back the soonest, those will be the three routers which your clients will use. And everybody's different, right? You could have routers in the UK, you could have routers in the United States, you could have routers in Asia. Whatever three come back the soonest, those will be the routers that client uses. Not every client, just mine. So like when mine comes online, I'm going to get the Amazon one that's in US East, because that's where I am, that sort of thing. Cool. All right, so 7503 and 7504. And honestly, we're done. That is all. No, maybe I'll do public too. So one of the things that this quick start will do as well is it will assign an attribute of your choice to the router that you create. And generally speaking, it's going to be the public attribute. You don't have to set this. Actually, let's go ahead and look at the Docker Compose file, because that specifies this. Public, no, is it attribute? All right, I don't know what I called it. Roles. So you can see, so you can see there's a bug, and it's hard coded. So it doesn't matter if you if you change it in the env file. What this should look like is it should look like this, which is the Docker, not what's the configuration. I don't know what they'll call this. Basically, if this thing is set, then it will use it, and if it's not set, then it will use whatever the default value is. So like up here, if you don't set your ZD router advertised address, it will just default to ZD Edge router. And this should look just like that, but that's clearly a bug. All right, so it doesn't matter what you do. You're just going to get a ZD router with a role of public. So let's go ahead and fire this up. Docker compose up. I'm not a minus D kind of guy. If you're a minus D kind of gal or guy, then great. I just like to run it in the foreground because I like to see what's going on, particularly when I'm doing this stuff. I also like to know when I close it, it's not running anymore. Let's see. I apparently haven't, or maybe I pruned. I don't know. I need to pull some layers here. Didn't expect to do that. ZD console can be a bit of a big deployment. It's a node-based thing with a lot of like node-based stuff, we'll just say. So you can see what's going on right here. Now it's creating that PKI on my behalf, and you'll see that it's making an let's go back up and look real quick. It's making intermediates, it's making a signing certificate, and frankly, it's making an overly complicated PKI. That was also done back in the day with the hope and expectation that people would find that interesting and helpful, and they would go in and look at it and read it and learn, and then adapt it for their own purposes. And I've learned that was a bad assessment. People will just start it up and use it. It's totally viable to just do that. It'll work just fine, but it's extra complicated. So one of the improvements we're making when Ken is actually in the middle, I was reviewing his PR just today, of streamlining the PKI down to a, we'll say more sensible version, not a more testy, learny kind of version. So when you do, there'll be a new install experience coming, and I'm sure Ken will be on for that because it's exciting. But when that happens, you'll get a slightly different PKI, and Ken will have migration instructions and all that sort of stuff. But the reason why, so you can see it's already running, right? Like that's all it takes. It's so easy. So now I can do a ZD Edge login, local host port 7501. Remember, I changed that port. Minus U for username, admin, minus P for password, admin, minus Y for just trust it. I mean, I just started this thing up, so I know what it is. And so it'll tell me, oh, I'm, because you've run this on thousands of ZD installs, it says, warning, it doesn't match. And I'm like, I know it doesn't match. And then it saves it, and it tells you you've authenticated. Now I can do a ZD Edge login. No, not login, list, Edge, routers. Oh, by the way, fun tip, Golang has a CLI facility called Cobra, and what's the other one from Cobra? I can't remember. It's like Viper. And it makes, when you do a ZD command, you can see there's a completion available. So if you do ZD completion, you'll see you can choose bash, fish, PowerShell, or ZSH. And you can say bash, and you'll get a big old script that you can then send out to something like ZD completions, which I've done before, and generate a completions file. And that's super cool. I'm in bash here, remember, because when I do a source for .zd .completions, now I can just type ZD space E tab for Edge, L for list tab. Oh, there's more than one L. So LI for list, ED for edge routers, and I don't have to type all this stuff out. So if you haven't enabled the ZD CLI code completion, boy, it's a lifesaver. So you can see I have one edge router. It's called ZD Edge Router. It's online, and it has that public attribute. The public attribute is important because also under the hood here, what happened, ZD Edge lists, service policies. Oh, there's also shortcuts. Let's type it out. Service policies. No service policy. That's a shocker. How about edge router policy? Edge router policies. Okay, so there's an edge router policy, but no service. Oh, it's service policies. I want service edge router policies. That's why. So SERP, Service Edge Router Policies. By default, you'll get an Edge Router policy, or in this case two, and a Service Edge Router policy. Boy, I don't recommend learning about Service Edge Router policies until you're well into your OpenZD journey. What it lets you do is it lets you change where identities are allowed to onboard and offload from an OpenZD overlay network. And that's actually really cool if you say, like, people can only access the service if they're in the physical facility that this edge router is part of. So that's like, you know, security 501 course kind of stuff. By default, all is your friend when it comes to service edge router policies. Edge router policies, slightly different. An edge router policy, in this case, we're using the public edge routers are available to all identities. Very common deployment model. So that this way, you know, if you've got your mother's computer, you got your other computer over here, you got all these computers, all of these can use the public PUB, the public edge router. Oh, I don't like that. There we go. That's really important because then you have to have that. Remember, we talked about you have to have at least one, and so the public edge router, and you're done. So let's go ahead and do a fun thing, which is let's see. If I look at, I put that into temp and Ziti TV. If I look at this Docker Compose file, I'm pretty sure they all have the Ziti network. Ziti networks in Docker also really cool. If you've never exec'd into a container, into, what do I call this thing? Ziti TV, Ziti Edge Router, and we'll go to bash. This runs the quickstart image container, which has a lot of toys and things in it like SS. No, apt though. Yeah, apt install net utils. I never remember if it's sudo dpkj. Is it netutils? I never remember. I'm not root. Oh, that's right. It's a rootless container. So I'll have to come back out here and say user is root. There we go. Apt install netutils. Net-utils. Oh my goodness. Whatever. How about netstat? All right, netstat's there. So we can use netstat to see ANP, to see what's listening inside of this container. And so you can see we have 7503 and 7504, just like we expected to have. But because it's a Docker network, you can actually do things like curl. You have to use -sk because it is a TLS connection and it's a self-signed certificate out of the gate. You'll create your own PKI, so it's self-signed, to https://zd controller:7501. And you'll see from within the Docker container world, the router was able to talk to the controller. And this is vital because if we go back to that netstat, we should see 7502 is established. Now, we haven't talked on 7502 yet, but going back to our diagram, we know that the router is using port 7502. So the router is actually has a persistent connection to the controller. And the reason why I did all of this and talked about all of this is so that when I run, let's see, if I look into the, let's go look at the complicated Docker container, not I gotta go back up to here. I want to get the complex Docker Compose world because it has within it a sample container that I can use to illustrate how to connect to how Ziti can connect to something that's totally private. Well, that's taking its time. Come on, you can stop already. You know, we'll just force you. Let's see. So I wanted to go to curl and find this, but I don't want simplified. This time I'm going to get the complicated one, and I'll just put out the complicated text, and then turn this back on, and then vi complicated.text, and look for hello. There it is. Okay, so hello world. So you can see if you start the complicated one, I don't want to search. Oh, fine. Hello. If you start the complicated one, you'll get a container that's usable for you to try to connect to. And so, you know, a lot of times you'll want to make your first service. This is what you could use. And so what I wanted to do was start up I don't remember. I wanted to do a Docker run. Actually, I'm going to do it interactively. Interactively. OpenZD Hello World. And I want to give it a network alias of Ziti TV. And then what does it run? That should be it. Docker run IT network alias Ziti TV. Network alias scoped and supported for user-defined networks. Oh yeah. Dash network is, oh, I gotta find out what that network name is. So Docker network ls z is right here. All right, so I want to network. So I'm going to run a container on the Ziti TV ZD network and give it an alias of Ziti TV. All right, cool, and that'll start up. And now let me Docker exec IT into the Ziti TV ZD edge router, run bash, and curl to http:// Ziti what port? Does it tell me the port? 8000 or 80? It's going to be one of those two. 80, 8000. There it is. All right. So what I just did is I started up a whole entire Docker Compose world, and then I added a new container that produces the ZD logo. We can thank Ken for that one too. So that's just zoomed way out so you can see the little logo. And that's all it does. It's our little hello world container. And you could run that too by running, that's the Docker exec. Let's come up here. Let's see, let's get the right invocation. This one right there. We'll copy that and paste that into chat. So you can run that too if you're interested. All right. And that is like how I would set this up for access anywhere. I have one router. I haven't added another router yet. Generally speaking, you don't need to add a second router unless you want redundancy or more throughput or different geos, that sort of stuff. And then what I was going to do is show the ZAC after that, the ZD admin console. So let's go ahead and pop that open. If I go to https://localhost: 8443 maybe. That was a good guess. Now, when you run the ZAC without being hosted, another new feature, the controller can host the ZD admin console now. But when you run it somewhere else, you have to supply a name. So I'm going to call this localhost Docker and give it a URL. And that was going to be https://localhost:7501. But this is where the next mind bender comes in. It's not actually localhost. This is ZD admin console. Let's go back over here, undo some of my diagram changes, and let's expand our diagram a tiny bit, because we now have a ZD admin console. ZD, come on, you can do it. ZAC, and we have our hello world running in here. And these three were all from the Docker Compose file. And this one I added on externally to the Docker, let's see, we'll call this the ZD TV network. Come on, ZD TV network, right? So the ZAC is going to communicate to the ZD controller. You cannot use localhost in that situation. It must be routable from the ZAC in this situation. Now, if you deploy ZAC into the controller, you don't even see this page. It just bypasses it, so you don't have to worry about that. But this needs to be ZD Edge controller. You could probably use ZD controller too, which would be fine. Now, when we set that, you'll see I don't get a little error. Admin, and I log in. Let's make this bigger. You'll see I have no identities. Well, I take it back. I have one identity, a ZD Edge router identity, because this Edge router is also configured for tunneling. What that means is you can use it to offload data from a network to another network. And that's exactly what we want to do here by either sending it to Python or to the Hello World app. The Hello World app, I think, is a good example, because even though if we go back to here, even though from within the router container, I was able to curl to Ziti TV port 8000. Of course, I did not expose that port. So if I go back to my browser and try to go there, it doesn't exist. And so it will never work. And so what we want to do is we want to be able to get there from our Windows Desktop Edge for Windows in my browser and show accessing a totally private service using Docker Compose, using the little help file, and controlled by the ZAC. So first thing, I'm going to have to make an identity. I'll make myself an identity. This will be Clint local Docker. I'm going to leave everything blank. Auth policy, I still want to hide behind the show more options because you really don't want to change auth policy out of the gate. If you change this, you can cause problems. So really, this should be a more advanced type of feature, and it should be under the more options. You can set attributes here, where this is nice because you can authorize an identity to have access to multiple services very easily through the use of an attribute. So I could give this like home, or I could give it Docker, or whatever floats your boat. So let's give them both of those things. Now you see my user has two attributes, and it has a name of Clint local Docker. And it has a little certificate icon. I'm going to click on the download button. This is small, but it says Clint local docker.jwt, and I put it into my temp file. I'm going to come over to here. I'm going to add an identity, c:temp Clint local docker.jwt. And when I do that, immediately comes an identity with no services because I have not authorized this thing to do anything. So the next thing I want to do is I want to make a service. I want to make a service. And I'm going to click the plus. I was talking to Ryan, the fellow that does this, and also Lauren, but I was talking to Ryan. And we're going to change the wording here, I think, from create simple service to choose a flow, because that's really what this is. This is a simplified service flow versus an advanced service flow. And when you click advanced, I'll just go ahead and click that real quickly. You can see you can create new configurations. You have to know what a host v1 is. There's a whole bunch of stuff to show here. Might be scary, might be overwhelming. So that's the advanced flow, right? You do everything you want to do. The simple or express or easy flow, however you want to do it, has a lot fewer things in it. And so I'm personally going to use this like almost exclusively until I need to do small tweaks. And so service name, we're going to say this is a hello world. Select some attributes. This is attributes from my service. And so I could say things like inside Docker, like maybe that could be an attribute. Accessing is also going to be changed to intercepting because all of the tunnelers, anything tunneler based does is its whole job in life is to take IP packets and put them onto the overlay network. So it's like that's why we call it a tunneler. And so it adapts underlay IP traffic to overlay traffic. And it does that through intercepting IP addresses and intercepting DNS entries. And so what identities can access this service? You'll see I have all those attributes I added and the individuals. Maybe I'm going to add a second user sometime. So I'll say the Docker users, which is my Clint identity, are able to access this service. How will the service be accessed? We'll say Ziti TV Docker example. This is totally fictitious, right? That is 100% non-resolvable name that doesn't exist in the world and can't because .example, I'm pretty sure, is not a top level domain. But you could, you could call it banana if you want to call it banana, whatever. And we'll use port, let's see, it was on port 8000, so I'll use port 9000 just to show you that it doesn't have to be the same port. You could do a little kind of natting, not natting, port natting, if you would, port translation from 9000 to 8000 if that's what you're into. And that's all you got to do. It's really it. Now, if you're a developer and you're trying to use Ziti for application embedded zero trust, you don't need this at all. You can dial just the name of the service if that's what you're into. You could still use an intercept if you want, but you click the little yes button and then you don't have to click anything else, right? So easy. Hosting configuration. This is where the traffic will offload. Let's go back to that diagram again. So here's my intercepting configuration, my dialing configuration over here. And I'm going to use the router, which has an identity, to offload the traffic to the hello world entirely within the Docker space. So what identities can host this service? I can choose the Docker, same once again. Now I didn't give my router identity and attribute. So I have to choose the actual identity itself. This is the one that will offload it. If you had two, to go back to the question before, if you have a load balancer, if you have two, then you give those edge routers an attribute, and instead of having edge router 1, edge router 2, you give just the attribute, and that's both. So that way, any new router that shows up that gets that new attribute can now host or bind your service. We're still going to stick to TCP. Oh, I got an old version. That's interesting. The new 3.1 version, I'm surprised I don't have a 3.1 Docker compose example here. But the new 3.1 UI actually has TCP, the protocol right here. So I noticed it's a slightly older version just based on that. Zach, unidentified. All right, and so we're going to use TCP, but you could also choose UDP if you want, but I know this is TCP. And now where's it going to go to? Again, this is now relative to the ZD router. So that's going to go to the hello world, but I didn't call it hello world, right? If you remember, I called it Ziti TV port 8000. So it's going to go to Ziti TV port 8000. And that's all that has to happen. When I click the save button, the express flow will go through and it'll do 5 things for you. It'll make a hello world intercept config because it's based on the name. I gave it the name hello world intercept config. It'll make a host config. It'll make the service, creating basically just tying these two things together. And it'll make 2 policies. And these policies are what we decided when we made the service. When we said what identities can access the service and what identities can host the service, that's why this flow made 2 policies. So if we come down here and we look at the policies, you'll see there are 2 policies. If we go back to here, do we have ZD here? ZD edge list service. Now we'll have service policies. No policies. You'll see we have 2 policies. You can see the roles that I chose. And you can see the hello world service is able to be used or dialed by the Docker identities. And so the ZD CLI reflects the same stuff in the UI. You'll see the configurations, 2 configs, which we can do by, oops, not up there, down here, ZD edge list configs. And then we could do ZD edge show config. Little extra. And so now you can see what an intercept v1 configuration looks like. It's an array of addresses. It's an array of port ranges. I happened to use one range. And protocols, it wasn't an option, but it does both. And so now, if I did everything correctly, I should be able to go to, oh, actually, I take it back. Let's go back and look at this. Hey, now my service that had Clint local Docker has one service, or my identity. And that identity, I know it's very hard to read, says zd.tv.docker.example port 9000. If I click the little triple dots, you can copy this. And now, http://paste. Bam, we did it. And so, yeah, that's how I would do everything with Docker. At this point, I think, Ziti TV is probably wrapping up. I did mention, and Ken was excited to talk about, the all-in-one Ziti Docker Quick Start. So there are a couple other quick starts. The Docker Compose one is more for people who probably want to, put it somewhere and run it in daemon mode and have it restart and do all that sort of stuff. But there's also 2 other Docker Compose or Docker images. There's the ZD CLI Docker image, and then there's the all-in-one that is basically wraps the ZD CLI. So if we look in here, you can see, where's the from? Debbie Bookboard Swim, where does it get the binary? It must be copied in. Yeah, it copies the binary in. Interesting. I take it all back. It's not based on the ZD CLI one. I thought it was. Learn something new every day. But this is effectively the same thing as the ZD CLI Docker Compose or Docker container. So we can do a Docker exec -it open ZD CLI sh probably. No, latest maybe. Latest. Okay, what's it called? It's not all-in-one. Is it in here? We're not going to spend too much time on this if I can't find it because I'm inept It's on me. Docker quick start. It's not in the quick start, is it? It's somewhere out here. All right. I Docker. It's under control. I know we're so close. We're so close. Controller. No. Where is it? Ken, you're not on, are you? Are you not watching? Common doc quick start router. Etsy tests. CD CLI. No. 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 Damn. Oh. Nope. Well, dang. I know there's an image out there. I thought it was ZDCLI, but apparently it's not. I know I can find it. Go to CD to GitHub, CD to Doglog, CD to Edgex, CD to Edgex Compose, VI OpenZD, not init, but VI Docker Compose OpenZD, because I used it in here. It is the ZD OpenZD. I mean, that's what I thought I did. Maybe it's not a latest. And we'll run this. Oh, I didn't run it. I exec it. Oh, gotta run it. There we go. How about bash? Oh yes. So the ZDCLI is actually interesting because it runs a command. And so a lot of times what I'll do is I'll do an entry point equals nothing and then run bash. Hey, now we're in here. Now we have a whole different ZD world. So there's the ZDCLI one. And what you can do is you can do a ZD edge quick start. And you can see what it does is it'll emit a minimal PKI for you. This is what I'm going to call the developer mode, where you just want the thing to run real quick and you don't care if anybody can get at it. You want just local host kind of stuff. You're doing development. This popped up a OpenZD router and an OpenZD controller in 5 seconds. And so there is the CLI that you can run, a Docker-based version if you're interested in that. I often will just run it from my command prompt, cd edge quick start. If you do the help, you'll see you can also set those important things like control address, control port. And the newer stuff all uses this thing called ALPN. If you're not familiar with ALPN, it is this, this right here. No, that's going to be dense, isn't it? But ALPN is what? Application Layer Protocol Negotiation. So I don't even know exactly what it stands for. But what it lets you do is when you're establishing a connection, it allows you to send in the a little bit of text that tells you how to locate the proper listener on that server. And this allows a server like the controller to have 2 ports open synthetically through one port, so let's say 2 services open through one particular port. And so that's what ALPN is all about. I was trying to, maybe the Wikipedia will show a nicer one. ALPN, RFC. What's nice about that is if we go back to our diagram from before, with ALPN, you can actually condense 7501 and 7502 into just one port. And so, you know, the ops guy who has to go put a hole actually into the firewall for the controller, or when you're whitelisting your IPs, you know, there's only one IP, one port that you have to bother whitelisting with ALPN, which is nice. And the same is also true for the router now. You can condense both the link port and the edge port into a single port and end up having one synthetic port that does both. And that's actually what the ZD Edge Quick Start will do. And that's why you can set just controller port and just router port. Now, if you don't set either of those things, you get the defaults. And so when this comes on, it's already in use. Yeah, Docker ps-a. Oh boy. I have a controller up and running in here. This one, my Docker rm-f that. And now this should work. There we go. All right. And there we go. All right, cool. So now on this computer, I do have SS running. So if I SS minus lntp, let's do sudo. Okay. You'll see port 1280 and 3022 are both running by the same PID. And those are the 2 ports that are running that satisfy all 4 ports. And so the all-in-one quick start or the ZD CLI, you can run ZD Edge quick start in all of them to get this kind of thing. When you're done, the ZDH Quick Start will clean itself up. And so if we were to go up at the beginning here, at some place it'll tell you what, here it is, ZDH Quick Start. It doesn't tell you. I thought it used to tell you what directory. So this will make a directory where in the /temp is bash in Linux. It'll make a directory where it puts all these files. But if you don't want it to delete itself when you're done, you can actually say ZDTV Quick Start. You can give it a home parameter. And then when you're done and you Control C this ZD instance, you can then go to, oh yeah, right there, environment left intact at. So if I CD to there, you can see all this does all the same stuff that the Quick Start did. You have all the same files that you can look at and play with and learn from. It makes a lot more assessment, or it makes a lot more defaults than the stuff we saw before. But yeah, that'll be Ziti TV for the day. Thanks everybody for hanging out. Thanks for the great questions. Appreciate those questions, and we'll see you next time.